You're about to witness the story of Hollow Ridge, a village in the Virginia Appalachians, forever changed by events in the winter of 1902. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time you heard this story. We want to track how this haunting tale travels across time and place. In the winter of 1902, the Virginia Appalachians lay beneath a layer of frost that whispered with the chill of early morning. The valleys were narrow, the ridges steep, and the forests stretched in unbroken waves of pine and oak, so dense that sunlight rarely touched the forest floor, except in fleeting, hesitant bursts. It was here, among these hills and hollows, that the people of a small village, isolated, self-reliant, and cautious of the wider world, faced a series of events that would mark their lives in ways both subtle and enduring. The kind of events that would linger long after the snow melted, the leaves fell, and the first trains of spring passed through distant stations, unseen and unremarked by the world beyond the mountains. The village itself was modest, a scattering of cabins and homesteads clinging to the curves of the ridges, connected by dirt paths worn smooth by years of foot and wagon traffic. Smoke from chimneys spiraled upwards in thin, hesitant columns, dissolving into the cold morning air. Children ran along narrow roads to the one-room schoolhouse, their laughter faint in the distance, while farmers prepared tools and livestock for the relentless rhythm of daily labor. Life here was measured, deliberate, and deeply entwined with the land. Every tree, stream, and hollow held a memory, a pattern passed down through generations, and yet even in this familiarity, the events that were about to unfold would shatter the sense of predictability the villagers had relied upon. It began with small disappearances, the sort that one might overlook if not for their recurrence. Items went missing from cabins, pieces of clothing, household objects, even food, vanishing without a trace. A hat left on a porch would be found hours later in a field beyond the limits anyone should have traversed. Animals reacted to something unseen, uneasy in their pens, ears pricked, tails stiff, glancing toward empty spaces as if acknowledging a presence invisible to the human eye. And then came the sounds, soft, measured, and unfamiliar, drifting from the hills at dusk, fading into the forest before anyone could pinpoint their source. A rhythm of uncertainty settled over the village, subtle at first, yet relentless, threading itself into the consciousness of those who lived there. People spoke in hushed tones by candlelight, recounting moments when doors seemed to move, when the wind carried words indistinguishable yet suggestive of intent. Children described fleeting shapes at the edges of vision, figures that seemed familiar yet could not belong to anyone alive. The elders, who had witnessed decades of seasons, storms, and human folly, felt a weight they could not name, a sensation that the valley itself had changed, that the space they had known since birth had become capable of harboring something beyond comprehension. And the questions began. Who was responsible for the disappearances? Were the missing still in the village, hidden, trapped, or worse? Was there a natural explanation, wolves, illness, accidents in the rugged terrain, or did something inexplicable move among the hills? None could say. Histories written long after these events struggled to capture the texture of life in those days, the cadence of fear threaded through routine, the quiet anticipation each villager carried as they approached the forest edge or called their children in from the evening shadows. For those who lived through it, there was a constant awareness, a vigilance that transformed the familiar into a landscape fraught with uncertainty. We know the names of some of those who vanished, the families whose absence left gaps in gatherings, chairs left empty at tables, spaces at the schoolhouse where voices once belonged. Records, sparse and incomplete, hint at investigations conducted by neighbors and town officials, search parties organized through snow, fog, and dense woods. But the outcomes were inconclusive. Footprints were found, then lost. Objects appeared where no one could have placed them. Voices were heard, though no mouths moved to make them. And in the midst of these events, life continued. The rhythm of work, worship, and social interaction carried on, each day punctuated by unease, each night by anticipation of what might emerge from the shadows. It is tempting, reading these accounts decades later, to imagine that fear alone magnified perception, that isolation and hardship conjured specters from memory and expectation. And yet, the consistency across multiple witnesses, the corroborated movements, sounds, and subtle disturbances, suggests a pattern not easily dismissed. Something happened in these mountains that winter, something recorded in letters, diaries, and the careful notations of villagers who sought to preserve clarity amidst uncertainty. What that something was remains unconfirmed, yet its influence endured, shaping behaviors, perceptions, and the collective memory of the valley long after the snow melted, long after the hills returned to their ordinary silence. Tonight, we revisit the story of the Virginia Appalachians in 1902, a story of families who vanished, of whispers drifting through the trees, of shadows whose origin cannot be verified, but whose impact cannot be denied. We will explore each detail with care, tracing the reports of witnesses, the sparse records preserved in town ledgers, and the recollections passed down through generations. And as we do, you may find yourself asking, what truly happened in those hills? What can vanish so completely, and yet leave traces that endure? And how, after more than a century, does the memory of these events continue to echo through the quiet Appalachian forests? To understand what transpired in the Virginia Appalachians during the winter of 1902, one must first understand the land itself, the communities it nurtured, and the rhythms of life that defined them. The valleys were narrow, carved over millennia by streams that twisted and turned through the hills, their courses dictated by glacial remnants and the slow erosion of rock. Forests blanketed the mountains with thick layers of oak, chestnut, and hemlock, creating a canopy under which light filtered unevenly, shaping shadows and pockets of deep darkness that shifted as the sun arced across the sky. The people of this region had lived in tandem with these hills for generations. They were farmers, woodcutters, and craftsmen, deeply attuned to seasonal cycles, weather patterns, and the subtle cues of animal behavior. Their knowledge of the land was intimate, almost instinctual, passed down through observation and oral tradition rather than formal schooling. In 1902, the village at the center of our story was home to a few dozen families, each with ties that extended across the ridges and hollows. Houses were modest, constructed from timber felled nearby, stone foundations laid by hands accustomed to labor. Roofs were steep to shed snow, chimneys tall to carry smoke away from living spaces, and porches extended toward the roads, inviting conversation and observation. Life was simple, measured by tasks both necessary and communal: tending fields, caring for livestock, repairing fences, fetching water from nearby springs, and gathering for weekly church services that also served as a hub for social interaction. Even in the quietest moments, the community was connected, aware of each other's movements, illnesses, and achievements. News traveled slowly but reliably, and the rhythms of daily life were predictable, almost comforting. Yet the predictability of these hills was both a blessing and a vulnerability. For those living so close to the earth, intimately familiar with its patterns, any deviation, however minor, was immediately noticed. A missing tool, an unexplained footprint, a sudden silence where children had laughed yesterday. These were signals the villagers could not ignore. And in the winter of 1902, the signals multiplied. At first, they were subtle, almost imperceptible. Livestock reacted to unseen presences. Chickens froze mid-cluck as though listening to distant sounds, and dogs barked into the void of the forest, their cries unanswered. Families discovered objects displaced in ways too deliberate to be accidents. A basket left on a table turned upside down, a lantern repositioned from its usual perch. Each instance seemed minor, yet the accumulation created a sense of unease that quietly pervaded homes, fields, and forest paths. The people of the village were deeply practical. They relied on observation, logic, and experience to navigate daily life, and when anomalies occurred, they sought natural explanations first. Wolves and coyotes roamed these forests, and occasional misadventures among the hills were not unusual. Children often wandered farther than intended, or fell into frozen streams. Yet the patterns in 1902 were different. Objects returned in ways that suggested intentionality. Sounds echoed where no one had been, and glimpses of figures in the periphery of vision were consistent enough to be acknowledged, rather than dismissed as imagination. Even the elders, who had witnessed decades of storms, crop failures, and human tragedy, recognized the abnormality of the situation. Histories of Appalachian life in this period paint a picture of communities accustomed to hardship, but resilient in their routines. Homes were multi-generational. Children apprenticed in craft and farming from a young age, and adults shared responsibilities across households to ensure survival through harsh winters. Visitors were rare, and outsiders unfamiliar with the terrain were easily disoriented among the ridges and hollows. Communication with nearby towns was limited, relying on infrequent trips along rough paths or occasional stagecoaches. In such isolation, the absence or disappearance of individuals had a magnified impact. A single missing person could trigger hours of search through steep, forested slopes, and when multiple anomalies occurred in succession, the psychological weight on the community intensified dramatically. Documentary records, sparse but revealing, describe the families residing in the village, their names, occupations, and relationships. The Harper family, long established in the area, maintained a modest homestead on the eastern ridge, raising cattle and growing corn in terraced plots. Their children, accustomed to chores and play in the surrounding woods, were noted for their attentiveness and curiosity. The Callaways, whose cabin stood near the western stream, were skilled hunters and foragers, their knowledge of animal behavior meticulous, honed over decades. Both families, along with others, reported initial signs of disturbance. Mislaid tools, livestock reacting to invisible stimuli, and strange, intermittent sounds emanating from the forest. These were not isolated anecdotes, but repeated across multiple households, suggesting a pattern that spanned the village rather than confined to a single perception. Local authorities of the period, though limited in resources and expertise, attempted to respond. Notices were issued to residents to remain vigilant, search parties were organized, and the terrain was combed systematically for clues. The difficulty was extraordinary. Snow and frost obscured footprints, fog filled hollows and valleys, and the dense canopy made long-distance observation almost impossible. Investigators documented anomalies meticulously, noting the positions of objects, timing of sounds, and behavioral reactions of animals and humans alike. Their notes, preserved in town ledgers and letters, reveal a community grappling with uncertainty, attempting to reconcile rational explanations with evidence that defied immediate understanding. Perhaps most compelling in the historical record are the accounts from children, who often served as unwitting witnesses to events adults later struggled to describe. These accounts describe figures glimpsed at the edge of vision, voices calling their names when no one else was present, and objects moving in ways suggestive of purpose. Adults, initially skeptical, came to acknowledge the credibility of these observations, especially when corroborated across different households. The pattern was undeniable. Something within the hills, or perhaps something connected to the environment itself, was exerting influence in ways that challenged conventional perception. As the winter deepened, the village's routines adapted. Children were kept closer to home, work in the fields was conducted in pairs, and nightly gatherings became both social and observational, with adults monitoring for signs of movement or sound from the forest. These adaptations, while practical, also reveal a psychological shift. The villagers were not merely responding to external stimuli. They were collectively internalizing the presence, integrating the unknown into their consciousness, and shaping behavior around it. Observers later noted that this period marked a fundamental change in the community's dynamic, a transition from ordinary rural life to one defined by vigilance, perception, and the negotiation of unseen forces. This historical context is crucial. Without understanding the environment, the routines, and the social structure of the village, the significance of the events that followed would be obscured. The hills of Virginia Appalachia were not simply a backdrop. They were active participants in the story, shaping the visibility, accessibility, and perception of the phenomena that emerged. The dense forests, narrow valleys, and steep ridges were integral to both the mystery and the village's response, creating conditions where subtle anomalies could grow into enduring narratives that would define the community for decades. By the end of these opening weeks in 1902, the village existed in a state of heightened awareness. Every sound, movement, and shadow was observed and catalogued in diaries, letters, and oral accounts. The boundaries of ordinary life had expanded to include uncertainty, suspicion, and cautious interpretation. And in this environment, the story of the vanished families, the whispering voices, and the fleeting shadows was set to unfold. A story that would leave traces not only in memory, but in the very landscape of the hills themselves. As winter deepened in the Appalachian Valley, the small village in Virginia found itself caught between ordinary life and something that defied explanation. Days were short. Frost clung to the edges of the forest, and the wind cut sharply through the hollows. In the early mornings, the villagers would emerge from their cabins to tend livestock or collect firewood, only to notice subtle changes, things they could not ignore but could not yet explain. A door that had been securely latched the night before might be slightly ajar. A tool left in the barn would be repositioned. Even the snow, freshly fallen overnight, seemed to carry the impressions of movement where no person had tread. Each anomaly was recorded meticulously, for the villagers had begun to understand that these were not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern, one that seemed to circle the village with quiet, deliberate persistence. The children, particularly, became keen observers. They noticed that certain sounds repeated in rhythm, almost as if someone, or something, was walking through the forest and pausing at intervals. The soft crunch of snow, the snap of a twig, the flutter of birds disturbed from their perches, All were catalogued in the minds of those who roamed the woods. Some children began keeping informal notes, sketching trees, marking points where they had glimpsed shadows, and recounting whispers they heard while no adult was present. The accounts were dismissed initially as childish fancy, yet the consistency across witnesses soon compelled even the most skeptical adults to pay attention. One such observer was young Martha Harper, age 12, whose sharp eyes and quiet nature made her a reliable witness. On December 3rd, she recounted seeing a figure near the frozen stream that ran beside the village. The figure stood motionless for several minutes, partially obscured by the branches of a dense hemlock. Its shape was unmistakably human, yet it did not move when approached, and it did not retreat. When Martha called out, it vanished, leaving no footprints in the snow. She described a sensation not of fear, but of being watched, of a presence lingering just beyond perception. Her account, shared with her family and neighbors, was corroborated later by others who had observed fleeting figures in the same location at similar times. Livestock also became inadvertent witnesses to the inexplicable. Cows would refuse to enter certain pastures, horses shied violently for no visible cause, and chickens would freeze mid-step, their feathers ruffling as if responding to a sound inaudible to human ears. Hunters familiar with the terrain began reporting that game animals appeared more skittish than usual, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested awareness of a presence beyond their senses. These observations, when collected, revealed a pattern. The disturbances were not random. They followed the contours of the village and the surrounding forest, concentrated along the edges of human habitation, yet extending into the deepest hollows. For the villagers, it became increasingly clear that something, or someone, was moving with intention, and the forest itself seemed to carry messages in the form of sounds, shadows, and subtle rearrangements of objects. Amid these early signs, individual families began to experience more pronounced events. The Callaways, whose cabin rested near the western ridge, reported hearing whispers within the home, even when no one else was present. The words were indecipherable at first, but gradually a pattern emerged. Phrases reminiscent of conversation, questions directed at them personally, uttered in a tone that was both familiar and impossible to place. Windows were found open when they had been securely latched, doors unlatched despite heavy locks, and chairs or tools moved into unusual positions. The family attempted logical explanations, wind drafts, misremembered actions, but the cumulative effect became impossible to ignore. The Harper family, living near the eastern ridge, experienced something equally troubling. One evening, Mr. Harper returned from the fields to find the firewood neatly stacked in a pattern he had never arranged. The same night, a series of faint scratches echoed through the cabin, emanating from walls where no nails or animals could account for them. Mrs. Harper described a sensation of being observed, of eyes upon her even when alone. Over time, these events intensified, creating a pervasive awareness among the villagers that something unseen yet deliberate was influencing both space and perception. Amid these occurrences, the psychological weight on the community began to mount. Diaries from the period reflect an escalation in tension. Observations that might have once been dismissed were now catalogued in meticulous detail. The position of objects, the timing of sounds, the patterns of animal behavior, and the accounts of children. Neighbors compared notes, sometimes late into the night, their conversations filled with caution and uncertainty. The collective consciousness of the village shifted. Ordinary actions were undertaken with heightened awareness, even trepidation. Farmers doubled the number of adults accompanying them to tend fields. Children were instructed to remain within sight lines, yet still reported phenomena that adults could not observe directly. The most unnerving reports came from nights when the fog lay thick in the hollows, obscuring the moonlight and silencing the usual nocturnal sounds. On such evenings, multiple households recorded hearing footsteps, voices, and distant movement in the forest. Patterns that suggested intelligence, deliberate pacing, and even observation of the human inhabitants. On December 18th, 3 separate families reported the same auditory event. A sequence of taps and soft whispers emanating from a clearing near the ridge, coinciding with the location of an abandoned homestead. The villagers, though skeptical by nature, could not reconcile these reports with known causes, and the phenomenon became a topic of grave concern in daily life. The children, particularly, began to articulate experiences adults could scarcely describe. Mary Calloway, aged 10, wrote in her journal, "I hear someone asking me where my brother is. I know he is not there, but the voice keeps calling." Similar entries were found among other children, reflecting both the pervasiveness and the consistency of the experiences. Adults, recognizing the precision of these accounts, began to integrate verification into daily routines, observing children during outdoor play, noting behaviors, and documenting any deviation from expected patterns. The process was slow, deliberate, and methodical, emphasizing observation over reaction, yet the psychological pressure was undeniable. Even the environment itself seemed altered. The snow fell in irregular patches, leaving bare spots in the middle of otherwise uniform expanses. Streams carried subtle ripples, as though responding to unseen movement. The forest canopy shifted in ways that caught the eye. Branches bent, leaves disturbed, and shadows extended unnaturally into areas that had been clear minutes before. Hunters and guides familiar with the terrain remarked that these changes were subtle but consistent, noting a pattern of occurrence that suggested the landscape itself was being subtly manipulated or observed. For the villagers, accustomed to a detailed awareness of their surroundings, this was profoundly unsettling. As days turned to weeks, the incidents intensified, both in frequency and in variety. Objects moved more conspicuously, sounds became more articulate, and figures were glimpsed more clearly at the edges of vision. Yet these were never full confrontations. There were no aggressive acts, no visible harm. Instead, the presence was patient, measured, and meticulous, intervening just enough to be noticed, never enough to be fully captured. This restraint, paradoxically, heightened fear. The villagers could sense awareness, intelligence, and intent, yet were unable to define it. It was a mystery that consumed attention, reshaped routines, and tested the limits of rational explanation. By the end of the month, the village had changed fundamentally. Children walked with heightened caution. Adults conducted daily activities in pairs or groups, and nightly gatherings became opportunities to compare observations and verify accounts. Those who had previously dismissed anomalies now recorded them diligently, noting time, location, and any corroborating evidence from neighbors. Even the most practical, historically minded residents began to acknowledge the possibility that the phenomena were real, deliberate, and beyond immediate comprehension. The Appalachian winter, already harsh, became a backdrop for psychological tension that stretched every perception, eroded certainty, and wove the unknown into the very fabric of life. This extended period of rising dread, measured not in violent acts, but in persistent subtle disruption, set the stage for the events that would follow. The village was attuned now, every sound, shadow, and anomaly meticulously observed and analyzed. And within this heightened awareness, the first glimpses of visual phenomena would begin to emerge. Figures moving among the trees, shapes at the periphery of vision, and presences that suggested intelligence and intent. The stage was set, the tension ratcheted, and the ordinary rhythms of life were irreversibly altered by something that could not yet be named or explained. As January settled over the Appalachian Valley, the persistent anomalies that had plagued the village evolved into something far more tangible. The fog lay low in the hollows, curling around the ridges like an unseen tide, muffling sounds and blurring outlines. For weeks, the villagers had catalogued whispers, shifts of objects, and fleeting shadows. But now, glimpses of something concrete began to manifest. On the morning of January 12th, a group of hunters returning from the northern ridge reported a figure standing at the edge of the forest near the frozen creek. At first, it appeared as a silhouette, indistinct in form, yet unmistakably human in posture. Its presence was steady, unmoving, yet undeniably aware of those observing it. The hunters froze, neither daring to approach nor retreat, aware that this was no ordinary stranger wandering the woods. The figure's clothing was described in uncanny detail. A dress, simple in cut, reminiscent of garments worn by children in the previous decades, though its fabric appeared weathered beyond recognition. Its hair caught what little sunlight filtered through the fog, glinting with a faint, unnatural sheen. Observers would later recall that the figure seemed to exist simultaneously in shadow and light, blending into the forest while commanding attention. Attempts to move closer caused the figure to retreat, not in panic, but in measured steps, maintaining a precise distance that always kept it partially obscured. The hunters returned to the village immediately, breathless, sharing accounts that were at once alarming and consistent, a testimony that would galvanize the collective attention of the community. By mid-afternoon, more villagers ventured cautiously toward the northern ridge, compelled by a mixture of fear and the irresistible urge to witness. Families approached in pairs, lanterns held aloft to pierce the lingering mist, hearts pounding with both dread and anticipation. And there, at the periphery of vision, figures began to appear. Silhouettes moving among the trees, half seen in the gaps of fog and branches. Some were fleeting, others remained stationary, observing. Children's voices recounted seeing small, human-shaped forms, peeking from behind trunks or slipping silently between shadows. Their actions deliberate, purposeful, yet never aggressive. Adults, accustomed to rational explanation, struggled to reconcile the evidence with their understanding of the world. Something alive, something intelligent, yet intangible, had entered their reality. The auditory phenomena that had haunted the village for weeks now intertwined with these visual confirmations. Whispers echoed from places unseen, sometimes directly responding to observers' comments, other times repeating passages noted in diaries, or spoken in tones only a child's voice could produce. One young girl, aged 9, described seeing a figure tilt its head toward her, as if acknowledging a question she had whispered aloud moments before. Others reported eyes, bright, deliberate, and fully aware, gazing from darkened hollows, only to vanish when approached. The villagers began to understand that the presence was not random. It observed patterns, it reacted to attention, and it seemed intent on maintaining its own elusive autonomy. Farmers tending livestock witnessed horses freezing mid-step, staring into forested expanses where nothing visible moved. Dogs barked and whined at corners of the yard, devoid of tangible cause, while chickens hesitated at coops, seemingly aware of observers they could not see. These visual disturbances, subtle yet undeniable, combined with auditory cues to create a multisensory impression of intelligence. Patterns emerged. Shapes appeared at dawn and dusk, avoiding direct light, but positioning themselves at key observation points. Shadows shifted unnaturally, as if the air itself were responding to unseen occupants. A particularly striking incident occurred on January 18th, when 3 families converged near the western ridge. Lanterns held high, they observed small figures emerging from the fog, partially obscured by trees. The figures moved deliberately, pausing to glance at observers, then fading into the underbrush. The adults and older children present recorded every movement, the cadence of steps, the direction of gaze, the timing of disappearances. The precision of these observations suggested deliberate intent, and the accounts later correlated across diaries and letters, confirming a remarkable consistency. The villagers, long attuned to the subtle disruptions of daily life, now faced phenomena that were not only persistent, but undeniably visual, a tangible confrontation with the unknown. Inhabitants described an almost theatrical quality to these appearances. Figures emerged at predictable intervals, yet always maintained distance, preserving both mystery and safety. Some wore tattered garments resembling those of children from earlier decades, while others appeared more ambiguous, their forms difficult to describe in conventional terms. Observers noted that these presences interacted subtly with their environment. Twigs bent beneath invisible feet, leaves rustled as though brushed by a hand, snow was displaced in precise arcs. The landscape itself seemed complicit, emphasizing patterns, guiding attention, and amplifying perception. For the villagers, this convergence of sight, sound, and environmental nuance created a psychological intensity that eclipsed all previous disturbances. A particularly notable sighting involved Jonathan Price, a hunter familiar with the region for decades. He described observing a group of small figures moving in a deliberate line through the forest, pausing as though to acknowledge his presence. One figure, distinguishable by its smaller stature and distinct posture, lifted an arm in a motion that suggested both greeting and warning. Attempts to approach were futile. As Jonathan stepped forward, the figures receded, maintaining visual contact from the periphery. He returned to the village, shaken but resolute, in recounting every detail, providing corroboration that strengthened communal awareness of the events. Throughout January, the frequency of sightings increased. Even children not actively seeking the figures reported observing movement or hearing voices aligned with prior visual accounts. Schoolrooms, previously spaces of routine learning, became places where children shared sketchings of forested figures, noting positions, sizes, and interactions. Diaries meticulously catalogued the timing, location, and context of every encounter. The villagers, now deeply attuned to their environment, collectively maintained vigilance, documenting anomalies and discussing patterns that hinted at intelligence, deliberation, and awareness beyond human comprehension. The psychological impact was profound. Adults reported heightened anxiety, an acute awareness of shadows and peripheral movement, and a growing sense that the forest itself was watching. Children oscillated between fascination and fear, documenting observations while avoiding prolonged exposure. Families altered routines, avoiding areas where the figures had been most frequently seen, or moving in coordinated groups to reduce vulnerability. Despite these precautions, the phenomena persisted, emphasizing that proximity, observation, and attention did not dictate manifestation. The unknown remained autonomous, patient, and deliberate in its appearances. By the end of the month, The convergence of visual and auditory phenomena created a climactic awareness. The villagers no longer doubted the reality of the events. The forest was inhabited, not by creatures of legend, nor by animals easily explained, but by presences that observed, acknowledged, and interacted with the human inhabitants in a manner precise, intelligent, and purposeful. The lines between perception, memory, and reality blurred. Shadows moved, whispers answered unspoken questions, and figures materialized where logic could not account for them. The psychological weight of these experiences, compounded by the harsh winter, left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of the community. This period, the apex of visual and auditory manifestations, established a framework for understanding the events historically. The villagers, meticulous in observation, transformed their daily existence into a living record of encounters. Logs, diaries, sketches, and oral testimonies formed an extensive archive. Historians, anthropologists, and folklorists, who later examined these records, noted the precise correlation between accounts, the consistency of environmental interaction, and the subtle intelligence displayed by the phenomena. These accounts illustrate not a tale of immediate terror, but a sustained, deliberate engagement with the unknown, a visual horror that defied explanation and reshaped an entire community's perception of reality. When the visual manifestations gradually receded with the lengthening shadows of late January, the village of Hollow Ridge found itself suspended between relief and unease. The figures in the fog, the whispers in the trees, and the small, deliberate movements that had marked the apex of disturbance left behind an atmosphere that no longer required immediate explanation but demanded reflection. Villagers awoke each morning to quiet streets, but the memory of what they had witnessed persisted like a weight on the senses, shaping thought, conversation, and the rhythm of daily life. Families found themselves measuring the passage of time differently. The absence of overt phenomena did not translate into comfort. Instead, it produced a lingering anticipation, a readiness for what might reappear. Mothers noted the absence of children's carefree laughter in previously ordinary spaces, a subtle silence that reminded them of events in the forest. Fathers paused along familiar paths, eyes scanning the peripheries for shapes that were no longer present, yet remained vividly remembered. Even the youngest children, whose innocence had initially shielded them, carried in their imagination the echoes of figures, the intonation of voices, and the deliberate gaze of entities that had observed them so intently. In diaries and letters from that period, repeated phrases emerge. "I feel her near. The forest watches. She is still here." These statements were not whimsical. They documented an ongoing psychological presence that influenced behaviors, choices, and social interaction. The villagers' daily routines adapted in subtle ways. Meals were prepared earlier, pathways were altered to avoid areas of prior sightings, and group gatherings became standard practice to diffuse anxiety. Every minor anomaly, a rustle of leaves, a displaced tool, a sudden draft, was filtered through the lens of prior events, amplifying both caution and narrative cohesion. Community gatherings assumed a new tone. Even casual discussions in the church or along the main road incorporated recollections of the forest phenomena. Oral histories, shared nightly, became forums for collective sense-making, allowing villagers to test observations, verify details, and catalog experiences. Children presented drawings and notes from school, often depicting shapes and gestures observed in the fog, while adults compared accounts and reconciled inconsistencies. The act of recording, discussing, and organizing these encounters served not only as documentation, but also as a mechanism for emotional processing, providing structure amid uncertainty. Sleep became a mirror of waking awareness. Numerous households reported dreams suffused with echoes of what had been observed. The figures in fog, the whispered questions, the deliberate gestures. Dreams followed patterns familiar to daily experience. Pathways in the forest, trees lining the ridges, and the creek curling through the valley. The auditory component of these dreams mirrored waking phenomena. Voices intoning phrases from diaries, repetitive questions, and faint laughter that was simultaneously comforting and disquieting. Scholars examining these accounts later considered them a form of psychological imprinting, a reflection of collective perception embedded in both conscious and unconscious thought. Individuals reflected on their interactions with the unknown in ways that revealed a profound psychological impact. Adults wrestled with responsibility, questioning whether their vigilance, or lack thereof, had influenced events. Children oscillated between fear and fascination, their behaviors influenced by both imagination and memory. Long-standing beliefs about the natural world, safety and community coherence were challenged, prompting re-evaluation of what it meant to inhabit a landscape both familiar and extraordinarily altered. The forest, once a routine backdrop for daily life, became an active participant in the village's consciousness, a locus of observation and contemplation. Letters sent to neighboring communities reflected a duality of sentiment, cautionary and reverent. Villagers described the forest phenomena as both watchful and interactive, neither malevolent nor benevolent, yet unmistakably present. The emphasis was on awareness and respect, understanding that ordinary human perception was insufficient to account fully for what had been experienced. Travelers and visitors noted the altered demeanor of Hollow Ridge's residents, heightened attention to environmental detail, muted voices during communal activity, and a shared sense of cautious anticipation. These behavioral adaptations became woven into the cultural fabric of the community. Seasonal transitions further influenced perception. As winter deepened, snow blanketed the ridges and frozen creeks reflected light in unfamiliar ways. Sightings diminished, yet auditory and tactile anomalies continued. Doors opening and closing, soft footsteps on wooden floors, fleeting impressions on snow-laden paths. The physical environment seemed to retain memory of prior events, reinforcing a sense of persistent presence. Villagers developed informal rituals, walking in pairs along key pathways, documenting unusual occurrences, and holding nightly discussions to compare notes and maintain collective awareness. These routines, practical in appearance, also served as psychological anchors, integrating anomaly into structured observation. By spring, the forest's visual manifestations largely receded, yet the emotional and psychological aftermath persisted. Diaries compiled during the preceding months were meticulously organized, becoming both records of experience and instruments for communal reflection. Families shared entries during gatherings, comparing perceptions, reconciling differences, and recognizing consistencies. This process fostered a collective understanding that transcended individual experience. The village itself became a living archive of perception, memory, and interpretation. The presence of what had been observed, though invisible, was inscribed in behavior, conversation, and expectation. The long-term imprint of these events was profound. Even decades later, descendants recounted stories of figures in fog, whispers in the forest, and the precise, deliberate movements that had marked January of 1902. Community identity was shaped by these experiences. Caution, awareness, and respect for the forest's capacity to harbor the unknown became integral to local culture. Folklorists later emphasized Hollow Ridge as a case study in sustained interaction between human perception and unexplained phenomena, highlighting the psychological, social, and environmental dimensions that contributed to enduring narrative memory. Ultimately, the emotional aftershock was not a simple conclusion of fear or relief. It represented a complex interplay of memory, perception, and shared consciousness. The village had endured phenomena that could not be fully explained, yet had adapted, documented, and integrated these experiences into daily life. The events of that winter became more than a story. They became a framework through which human awareness, environmental observation, and collective psychology could be understood. Hollow Ridge's residents, both contemporary and successive generations, learned to live with presence and absence intertwined, understanding that some mysteries, though unseen, shape the contours of life indefinitely. As historians and researchers later noted, the lessons of Hollow Ridge extend beyond folklore. They illustrate how sustained, unexplained phenomena influence behavior, community structure, and cultural memory. The emotional imprint left on the villagers, captured through diaries, letters, and oral histories, reveals the ways in which perception, anticipation, and psychological engagement can coexist with historical reality. It is a story of adaptation, awareness, and the subtle power of the unseen, a reminder that even in the absence of violent spectacle, the mind, the environment, and the extraordinary intersect to produce experiences that endure far beyond their initial appearance. As the evening shadows lengthened over Hollow Ridge, the valley seemed to settle into a fragile quiet, one that was neither comfort nor finality, but a pause in a story that had already become part of the landscape. The events of 1902 had altered the valley irreversibly, shaping both physical and social spaces in ways that were subtle yet profound. Families, once untroubled by the forest's presence beyond providing timber and firewood, now walked its edges with a measured attentiveness. Children, who had once raced along the creek and into the dense undergrowth with abandon, moved more deliberately, their imagination tempered by the memory of what had been seen and heard. Even adults, the pillars of routine and experience, carried a heightened awareness, a careful observation that extended into fields, pathways, and interiors alike. In letters sent to neighboring towns, villagers wrote of the quiet persistence of the unseen. They described feelings that were difficult to articulate, a sensation of being observed, the impression of interaction without contact, the perception of intelligence in absence. These were not accounts of terror alone, but of an expanded consciousness in which ordinary routines intersected with phenomena beyond the grasp of contemporary understanding. Travelers and scholars who arrived decades later were struck not by a tale of spectacle, but by the enduring subtlety of experience. The manner in which a valley, a forest, and a single winter could imprint upon the human mind with a clarity and permanence that defied conventional narrative. Oral histories, collected through decades, attest to the precision with which events were remembered. Descriptions of sound, movement, and environmental detail align across generations, suggesting that the initial experiences created a template for communal memory. Children's recollections of whispered phrases, adults' notes on displaced objects, and the silent observation of spaces once familiar, all converge to illustrate the interplay of perception, expectation, and social reinforcement. In this way, Hollow Ridge became not only a site of unexplained events, but a repository for collective experience, a place where memory itself seemed to interact with the physical environment. The reflection upon these events, when considered today, invites a broader inquiry into human understanding of the unknown. How does a community adapt when faced with persistent phenomena that evade explanation? How do perception, imagination, and history intersect to create narratives that endure for decades, even centuries? Hollow Ridge offers an answer not through resolution, but through adaptation. Families established informal protocols, observation journals, paired walks, nightly discussions, and cautious exploration of previously unexamined areas. These practices, while pragmatic, also serve to structure perception, to impose order on the indeterminate, and to sustain a community's engagement with phenomena that could neither be fully dismissed nor fully controlled. In the broader context of Appalachian history, Hollow Ridge's experience illuminates a key intersection between environment and human response. The dense forests, rolling ridges, and secluded hollows provided both the backdrop and the medium through which the extraordinary unfolded. Environmental factors, the shifting light of winter, fog that clung to the hollows, the layering of snow and ice, interacted with human perception in ways that shaped the narrative. Observers were drawn into a dialogue with the landscape, one that was mediated by awareness, attention, and social context. This dialogue produced experiences that were simultaneously personal, shared, and historical, contributing to a sense of continuity and significance that transcended the immediate events. The cultural imprint of these events extended far beyond the winter of 1902. Families maintained stories that informed behavior, guided decision-making, and shaped communal identity. Seasonal cycles became intertwined with memory, reinforcing awareness of environmental cues and social expectation. Elders narrated experiences to the young, embedding both caution and curiosity in each retelling. Researchers, decades later, noted the remarkable fidelity of these oral histories, emphasizing the way repeated engagement with memory can preserve perception in ways that documents alone cannot capture. Hollow Ridge, in this sense, became a living archive, a dynamic intersection of life, memory, and unexplained phenomena. Perhaps most striking is the nature of absence within these recollections. The missing, the unseen, and the unexplainable remained central to narrative coherence. The figures glimpsed in fog, the whispers in trees, the movement in peripheral vision. None required physical validation to influence human experience. The power of Hollow Ridge's story lies in its demonstration that presence is not contingent on the corporeal, and absence can be as formative as interaction. Observers learned to navigate a world in which uncertainty was persistent, yet patterns, however subtle, were interpretable. This cultivated a form of attentiveness that permeated daily life and shaped psychological resilience, even amid lingering unease. For contemporary audiences, the reflection invites both fascination and contemplation. How might such experiences translate to modern perception? What does it mean to live in proximity to events that defy rational explanation? And how does memory codify such events into culture and behavior? The narrative of Hollow Ridge demonstrates that history is not solely composed of dates and recorded actions, but also of lived experience perception, and the subtle influences of the extraordinary on ordinary life. This is not a story of closure, but of enduring presence, a lesson in attentiveness and respect for the dimensions of reality that escape easy classification. As we leave the valley in imagination, as we picture the snow-laden ridges, the fog-wrapped hollows, and the quiet forests, the question remains: what does it mean to truly witness, to record and remember, yet remain uncertain of ultimate truth? Hollow Ridge stands as a testament to the human capacity for observation, for adaptation, and for reflection. It challenges assumptions about certainty, history, and the scope of experience. And in the silence of the Appalachian winter, one might still feel, if only faintly, the echo of the voices, the deliberate movement in the forest, and the reminder that some mysteries endure, not because they are unresolved, but because they are lived. If you are still listening, then for a moment you are a part of Hollow Ridge's ongoing story, sharing in the observation, reflection, and collective memory that defines a community forever altered by what it encountered. Consider this as more than a tale. Consider it a lesson in presence, history, and the delicate interplay between what is seen, what is felt, and what remains just beyond comprehension. The valley waits, the forest watches, and the memory endures. The events of Hollow Ridge are long past, yet their echoes remain, etched into the hills and forests. Families came and went, but the whispers stayed, carried by wind through the ridges, by shadows along the hollows. What you've heard tonight is only part of the story, a glimpse into a world where the ordinary and the unexplainable intertwine. And though the winter of 1902 has faded, the valley remembers. Look closely at the trees, listen closely to the wind, for Hollow Ridge never truly forgets.